The dirt beneath her fingernails was more honest than any wedding vow Nora Ellis had ever heard. As the first rays of morning light filtered through the pine trees surrounding her half-built cabin, she wiped sweat from her brow with the back of her hand and surveyed her progress. 3 walls up, 1 to go, and then the real work would begin. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. No man's going to want a woman who builds things. Nora smiled grimly as she hoisted another log into place. Good thing she wasn't looking for a man. Montana Territory, 1876. The world was changing fast, but out here, miles from the nearest town, time moved differently. Nora had purchased this plot of land with money saved from 5 years of teaching at a boarding school in Boston. 25 acres of wilderness that belonged to her alone. No husband to answer to, no father to disappoint, no students to shape into proper young ladies. Just Nora, the mountains, and the promise of a life lived by her own design. She positioned the log carefully, making sure it was level before securing it. Her muscles ached from days of labor, but there was satisfaction in the pain. Each log represented one more step toward independence. The sound of hoofbeats made her freeze. Visitors were rare and rarely welcome. Reaching slowly for the rifle leaning against the wall, Nora turned to face the approaching rider. The man who emerged from the tree line sat tall in his saddle, silhouetted against the morning sun. His horse, a magnificent chestnut, snorted and pawed at the ground as the rider surveyed Nora's work. "Morning, madam," he called, touching the brim of his hat with 2 fingers, his voice carried easily across the clearing. "Quite an undertaking you've got here." Nora didn't lower her rifle. "State your business." The man swung down from his horse with easy grace. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30 or so, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. His clothes were trail-worn but clean, his boots scuffed from hard use. "Name's Xavier Jacobsen," he said, keeping a respectful distance. "I'm passing through on my way to Helena, saw your smoke and thought I'd check if everything was all right." His eyes flicked to the walls of her cabin. "Don't often see a woman building her own place." "Well, now you have," Nora replied, finally lowering her rifle slightly. "I'm fine, as you can see. Just busy." Xavier nodded, his eyes taking in the cleared land, the stack of logs waiting to be placed, and the crude tools scattered nearby. "You've done good work here," he said, and there was no condescension in his tone, only genuine appreciation. "But that roof's going to be the devil to manage alone," Nora bristled. "I'll manage just fine." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "No doubt, but it'd go faster with help." He glanced up at the sky. "Weather's turning, see those clouds building to the west. Storm's coming, maybe 3 days from now. Roof needs to be on before then." Nora followed his gaze. She'd noticed the clouds too, but had been hoping they didn't mean what she feared. "Are you offering to help, Mr. Jacobsen?" "I am." "Why?" He shrugged, an honest gesture. "Been on the trail for weeks. Wouldn't mind some honest work and a place to rest before heading on. I'm handy with tools and I've built a cabin or 2 in my time." Nora studied him, searching for deception. She'd learned the hard way that men's offers of help often came with unspoken expectations. But there was something straightforward about Xavier Jacobsen that made her hesitate before sending him on his way. "I can pay you a fair wage," she said finally, "but I make the decisions. This is my land and my home." Xavier nodded. "Yes, madam, your build, your rules." He held out his hand. "Do we have a deal?" After a moment's hesitation, Nora tucked her rifle under her arm and shook his hand. His grip was firm but not overpowering, his palm calloused from work. "I'm Nora Ellis," she said. "And yes, we have a deal, but only until the roof is on." "Only until the roof is on," he agreed. "Where should I put my horse?" For the next few hours, Nora watched Xavier out of the corner of her eye as they worked side by side. He was strong and skilled, moving logs with practiced ease and offering suggestions without insisting on them. By midday, they'd made more progress than Nora had in the previous 2 days combined. "Mind if I ask what brings a woman out here alone?" Xavier asked as they paused to drink water from Nora's canteen. Nora wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. Same thing that brings anyone out here, I expect. A fresh start. Xavier nodded, seeming to accept that was all she was willing to share. Fair enough, it's good land you've chosen. That creek to the north should run year-round, and these trees will break the worst of the winter winds. You know this area, passed through a few times. Used to guide wagon trains before the railroad came through. He handed back the canteen. What are your plans for the winter? Got provisions stored? Some, Nora admitted. I've been focusing on getting the cabin built. But I'll hunt, and I brought seeds for a garden come spring. Xavier looked skeptical. Hunting's lean in winter, and it's getting late for planting much that'll produce before frost. Irritation flared in Nora's chest. I'm aware of the challenges, Mr. Jacobsen. I didn't come out here on a whim. He raised his hands in a gesture of peace. Never said you did, just offering what I know, take it or leave it. They returned to work in silence, the rhythm of their labor gradually easing the tension. By late afternoon, all 4 walls were up, and they began preparing the logs for the roof supports. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Xavier straightened and stretched his back. We should stop while we can still see what we're doing. I'll set up my bedroll by that stand of trees if that's all right with you. Nora nodded, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. That's fine. I've got a tent set up behind the cabin. She hesitated, then added, I've got beans and bacon if you'd care to share a meal. Xavier smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. I'd be much obliged, Miss Ellis, and I can contribute some coffee to the arrangement. They sat by the fire as darkness settled over the mountains, the flames casting dancing shadows across their faces. The beans were simple fare but hot and filling, and Xavier's coffee was strong and good. You've done this before, Nora observed, watching him move comfortably around the campfire. Building, I mean, Xavier nodded. My pa was a carpenter, taught me the trade before I was old enough to shave. He took a sip of coffee. After the war, I helped rebuild a few towns in Tennessee before heading west. You fought in the war, a shadow crossed his face. Yes, madam, Union side, but that's a long time past now. Nora recognized the look of a man who didn't want to revisit certain memories. She'd seen it often enough in Boston in the eyes of returning soldiers. My father was a builder too, she offered instead. In Boston, he didn't think it proper work for a woman, but he taught me anyway. Said it was good for me to understand how things were made, even if I'd never used the knowledge. Xavier's eyes reflected the firelight. Sounds like a complicated man. He was. Nora stared into the flames. He died last year, left everything to my brother, including the house I grew up in. So you came west. So I came west, she agreed, with enough money to buy land but not enough to hire someone to build on it. Hence, she gestured at the cabin. Xavier nodded thoughtfully. Bold move, most women wouldn't have the courage. Most women aren't given the choice, Nora replied. Or they're taught not to want it. They fell into comfortable silence, the crackling of the fire and the distant call of a night bird the only sounds in the clearing. Finally, Xavier stood and stretched. Thank you for the meal, Miss Ellis. I'll see you at first light. Nora watched him walk to his bedroll, his silhouette merging with the darkness. She wasn't sure what to make of Xavier Jacobsen, but she was grateful for his help. And if she was honest with herself, a small part of her was relieved not to face another night alone in the vast wilderness. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Nora emerged from her tent to find Xavier already up, tending a small fire with coffee brewing. Hope you don't mind, he said, nodding toward the pot. Thought we could use an early start. Not at all. Nora accepted the tin cup he offered. The coffee was hot and strong, clearing the last cobwebs of sleep from her mind. We should be able to get the roof frame up today. Xavier nodded, studying the cabin with a critical eye. And maybe start on the shingles if we push. That storm's not waiting on us. They worked efficiently together, falling into a natural rhythm. Xavier was strong and skilled, but he never made Nora feel as though her contribution was less valuable. Instead, he asked for her input and adapted to her methods, even when they weren't the ones he might have chosen. By midday, the roof frame was taking shape. Nora stood back, surveying their work with satisfaction. "It's going to be a good home," Xavier said, coming to stand beside her. "Solid, built to last." Nora felt a surge of pride. "Yes, it is. Your father would be proud," he added quietly. The unexpected comment caught Nora off guard. "I'd like to think so," she said after a moment. "Though he'd probably be scandalized that I'm out here unchaperoned with a strange man." Xavier's laugh was warm. "Fair point, though I hope I'm proving myself not too strange." Their eyes met, and Nora felt a flutter of something unfamiliar. She quickly looked away. "We should get back to work if we want to start on those shingles today." As the afternoon wore on, Nora found herself watching Xavier more than she should. The way his muscles moved beneath his shirt as he lifted the heavy roof beams. The careful precision of his hands as he worked. The occasional smile that transformed his weather-worn face into something unexpectedly handsome. "You're staring, Miss Ellis," Xavier said without looking up from the shingle he was cutting. Heat rushed to Nora's cheeks. "I was just observing your technique for future reference." "Of course," he replied, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Always happy to provide educational opportunities." Nora threw a small piece of bark at him, which he dodged with a laugh. The moment of lightness surprised her. It had been a long time since she'd felt playful with anyone, let alone a man she barely knew. As the sun began to set, they had completed the roof frame and laid the first row of shingles. Progress, but not enough. The clouds to the west were closer now, dark and threatening. "We'll need to work faster tomorrow," Xavier said as they cleaned up for the day. "That storm's moving quicker than I thought." Nora nodded, feeling a knot of anxiety form in her stomach. Without a roof, everything she'd worked for could be ruined by a heavy rain. "We'll start at dawn." That evening, as they sat by the fire eating a rabbit Xavier had snared, Nora found herself curious about the man across from her. "You said you were heading to Helena. What's waiting for you there?" Xavier poked at the fire with a stick. "Nothing specific." "Heard there was work for experienced builders with the town growing so fast. Thought I'd try my luck." "No family waiting," he shook his head. "Lost my parents years ago. No wife, no children, just me and the open road." He looked up at her. "What about you? No one back in Boston missing you?" Nora thought of the small circle of friends she'd left behind, fellow teachers who had been shocked by her decision to head west alone. "A few friends. My brother, though we've never been close after my father died." She paused, searching for the right words. It was as if a door opened. "I could stay and live the life everyone expected of me, or I could find out what else might be possible." "And this is what's possible?" Xavier gestured at the cabin and the surrounding wilderness. "This is just the beginning," Nora replied, surprised by the conviction in her own voice. "I don't know exactly what shape my life will take out here, but at least it will be mine to shape." Xavier studied her, his expression thoughtful. "You're an unusual woman, Nora Ellis." "Is that a compliment or a criticism?" "Definitely a compliment." His voice was soft, almost tender. "The world could use more people willing to build their own path." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition of kindred spirits despite their different journeys. Nora felt it like a physical presence, warm and unexpected. "Well," she said, standing abruptly, "we should get some rest. Dawn comes early." Xavier nodded, but his eyes lingered on her face. "Good night, Miss Ellis. Good night, Mr. Jacobsen." In her tent that night, Nora lay awake longer than she should have, listening to the whisper of wind through the trees and thinking about the man sleeping just yards away. There was something about Xavier that made her feel both unsettled and strangely at ease. It had been a long time since she'd allowed herself to be vulnerable around anyone, especially a man. Yet here she was, trusting a stranger with not just her safety, but the dream she'd crossed a continent to build. The next morning brought the scent of rain on the wind. They worked with renewed urgency, speaking little as they focused on completing the roof. By mid-afternoon, they had laid most of the shingles, but the storm clouds had darkened the sky to a premature dusk. "We're not going to make it," Nora said, looking up at the threatening sky. "Not before the rain starts." Xavier wiped sweat from his brow. "We will. We just need to change our approach." He glanced around the clearing, then pointed to the tarpaulin covering Nora's supplies. "We can use that to cover the unfinished section temporarily. It won't be pretty, but it'll keep the inside dry until we can finish properly." Together they secured the tarpaulin over the remaining open section of roof. They had just finished when the first heavy drops began to fall. "Inside," Xavier called over the rising wind. "Quick." They ducked through the doorway just as the sky opened up. Rain hammered against the newly laid shingles and the tarpaulin, which billowed but held. Inside, the cabin was dark and bare, just walls and a dirt floor, but it was dry. "We did it," Nora said, breathless with exertion and a strange, wild joy. "We actually did it." Xavier grinned at her, rain dripping from his hat. Never doubted it for a minute. They stood in the empty space that would soon be her home, listening to the storm rage outside. Thunder rolled across the mountains, and lightning briefly illuminated the interior through the gaps that would eventually be windows. "It's going to be beautiful," Xavier said softly, looking around the cabin. "You've chosen well, Nora." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the intimacy of it in the darkness sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold rain. "Thank you," she said, "for helping me. I'm not sure I would have finished in time without you." "You would have found a way," he replied. "But I'm glad I could be part of it." Their eyes met in the dim light, and for a moment Nora forgot to breathe. Xavier took a step toward her, then hesitated. "I should check the tarpaulin," he said, his voice rough. "Make sure it's holding." He moved to the far corner of the cabin, leaving Nora to wonder what might have happened if he'd taken that extra step toward her instead of away. The storm continued through the night. They made a small fire in the center of the dirt floor, where Nora planned to eventually build a proper hearth. With the smoke escaping through a temporary gap in the roof, they were able to cook a simple meal and dry their damp clothes. "Tomorrow I'll help you finish the roof properly," Xavier said as they ate. "After that, you'll need to think about a floor and a chimney before winter sets in." Nora nodded, trying to ignore the way her heart sank at the reminder that their agreement was almost complete. "I've got plans for all of that. I brought books with detailed instructions." Xavier smiled. "Of course you did. Why am I not surprised?" His tone was teasing but warm. "Still, books are one thing, experience is another. Winter in Montana is nothing to face unprepared." "Are you suggesting I can't handle it?" Nora asked, a defensive edge creeping into her voice. "Not at all, just that there's no shame in accepting help when it's offered." He poked at the fire. "I could stay on a bit longer. Help with the floor and chimney before heading to Helena. The work will be there whenever I arrive." Nora studied him across the fire. "Why would you do that?" Xavier was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe I admire what you're doing here. Maybe I'd like to see it succeed." He met her eyes. "Or maybe I'm just not in any hurry to say goodbye." The honesty of his answer caught Nora off guard. In Boston, men had courted her with flowery compliments and carefully constructed flattery. None had ever simply stated their feelings as plainly as Xavier just had. She began, then stopped, unsure what to say. "You don't need to answer now," Xavier said gently. "Just think about it. Another week or two could make all the difference before winter." Nora nodded, grateful for the reprieve. "I'll think about it." They fell silent, listening to the rain drumming on the roof and the occasional crack of thunder. Despite the storm raging outside, Nora felt oddly peaceful. There was something comforting about sharing this small, sheltered space with Xavier, a sense of connection she hadn't expected to find in her new solitary life. Eventually, they prepared for sleep, Xavier spreading his bedroll on one side of the cabin, Nora on the other. The fire between them cast long shadows on the walls. "Good night, Xavier," Nora said softly. "Good night, Nora," he replied. "Sweet dreams." Morning brought clearing skies and a world washed clean by the storm. Puddles reflected the blue sky and droplets sparkled on pine needles like tiny diamonds. Nora stepped outside the cabin and took a deep breath of the fresh, rain-scented air. "Beautiful day," Xavier said, joining her. His hair was tousled from sleep, his face shadowed with stubble, but his eyes were clear and bright in the morning light. "Perfect for finishing that roof," Nora agreed. They worked efficiently together, removing the tarpaulin and completing the remaining shingles. By midday, the roof was finished solid, waterproof and surprisingly professional-looking. Xavier stood back, hands on his hips, admiring their work. "Not bad if I do say so myself." "It's perfect," Nora said, a lump forming in her throat as she looked at the completed structure. It wasn't much yet, just walls and a roof, but it was hers. A home she had built with her own hands. With Xavier's help, yes, but still fundamentally her creation. "I've been thinking about your offer," she said, turning to face him, "to stay and help with the floor and chimney." Xavier waited, his expression carefully neutral. "I'd like that," Nora continued. "If you're still willing, I'll pay you fair wages for your time, of course." Something flickered in Xavier's eyes, disappointment perhaps, but he nodded. "That's fine. Though I'd be happy to help just for room and board." "No," Nora said firmly. "I don't want to be indebted to anyone. This is a business arrangement. I'm hiring you for your skills." "As you wish," Xavier agreed, his tone formal. "Shall we begin planning the floor this afternoon?" Over the next few days, they fell into a comfortable routine. They would work from dawn until dusk, with breaks for meals and water. Xavier taught Nora techniques for leveling the dirt floor and setting the foundation stones for what would become the hearth and chimney. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes enjoying companionable silence. Nora learned that Xavier had grown up in Pennsylvania, the son of a skilled carpenter who had passed on his knowledge and love of woodworking. After the war, Xavier had found it difficult to settle in one place, preferring the freedom of the open road and the satisfaction of short-term building projects. He'd been drifting west for years, working when he needed money, moving on when restlessness overtook him. In turn, Nora told him about her life in Boston, her years teaching at the girls' school, her complicated relationship with her traditional father, her decision to use her inheritance to forge a new path west instead of settling for the marriage her family had expected. "Weren't you afraid?" Xavier asked one evening as they sat outside the cabin watching the stars emerge. "Coming out here alone, I mean?" Nora considered the question. "Yes," she admitted, "but I was more afraid of the alternative, of living a life that was chosen for me rather than by me." She glanced at him. "Haven't you ever been afraid of your choices?" Xavier was quiet for a moment. "After the war, I had nightmares, bad ones. Being in crowds in cities, it made them worse. So I started moving, staying in open country when I could." He stared into the darkness. "Maybe that was running away rather than choosing something new, I'm not sure." "And now," Nora asked softly, "are you still running?" He turned to look at her, his face half illuminated by the fire. "I don't know, being here, building something that will last, it feels different." Their eyes held for a long moment, and Nora felt that same flutter in her chest that had been becoming increasingly familiar in Xavier's presence. This time, she didn't look away. "It's getting late," Xavier said finally, his voice husky. "We should get some rest." Nora nodded, disappointed despite herself. "Yes, we should." As she settled into her bedroll that night, Nora found herself wondering what it might be like if Xavier decided to stay beyond the completion of the floor and chimney. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. She had come west to be independent, to build a life that belonged to her alone. Yet the prospect of sharing that life, at least some part of it, with a man who respected her strength, rather than being threatened by it, was unexpectedly appealing. The following week passed in a blur of activity. They finished laying the wooden floor, a luxury Nora hadn't been sure she could manage on her own. Xavier showed her how to carefully fit the planks together, minimizing gaps that would let in cold air during winter. The chimney and hearth took shape stone by stone, a challenging project that required both strength and precision. Working side by side, passing tools and materials, their hands would occasionally brush against each other. Each time, Nora felt a jolt of awareness that was increasingly difficult to ignore. It wasn't just physical attraction, though that was certainly part of it. It was the way Xavier listened when she spoke, truly listened, as if her thoughts and opinions mattered. It was how he taught without condescension, explaining techniques while acknowledging and respecting her existing skills. It was the quiet companionship of their evenings, the shared laughter over small mishaps, the gradual building of trust. One afternoon, as they were gathering stones for the chimney from the creek bed, Xavier straightened suddenly, putting a finger to his lips. Nora froze, following his gaze to the edge of the trees. A doe and her fawn had emerged from the forest, moving cautiously toward the water. They were beautiful, delicate yet strong, perfectly at home in the wilderness. Xavier and Nora stood motionless, watching as the deer drank from the creek, ears constantly twitching for signs of danger. After a few minutes, the doe raised her head, sniffed the air, and led her fawn back into the shelter of the trees. "That's a good sign," Xavier said quietly. "Means they feel safe here." "Is that important?" Nora asked. He nodded. "Animals know things we don't. If they're comfortable on your land, it means you've chosen well." He looked around at the clearing, the cabin, the surrounding forest. "This is good country, Nora. It will sustain you if you respect it." "Us," Nora said without thinking. "It could sustain us." The words hung in the air between them. Xavier's eyes widened slightly, and Nora felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I mean," she stammered, "people. In general. Not specifically Nora," Xavier interrupted gently. He set down the stones he was carrying and took a step toward her. "Are you asking me to stay?" Nora's heart hammered in her chest. This wasn't what she had planned. She had come west to be independent, not to find a partner, and yet— "I don't know," she admitted. "I didn't expect you, any of this." She gestured between them. "I came here to build a life on my own terms." "And you have," Xavier said. "You made the choice to come west. You bought this land. You started building this cabin before I ever arrived." He took another step closer. "Nothing about you asking me to stay, if that's what you're doing, changes any of that." Nora looked up at him, at the sincerity in his storm-gray eyes. "And what about you? You've spent years avoiding putting down roots. What makes this different?" Xavier's gaze never wavered. "You do." The simple honesty of his answer stole Nora's breath. "I've never met anyone like you, Nora Ellis. Someone brave enough to reimagine her whole life. Someone who builds things with her hands and her heart." He smiled softly. "Someone who makes me wonder what it might be like to stop running." They stood so close now that Nora could feel the warmth radiating from his body. She thought about all the reasons this was a bad idea. They barely knew each other. Her plans hadn't included a man. The wilderness was no place for impulsive decisions. But none of those reasons seemed to matter as much as the feeling growing in her chest, a feeling of possibility and hope. "I'm not asking you to stay forever," she said carefully. "Just longer, to see what might happen." Xavier's smile widened, transforming his face. "I'd like that," he said. "Very much." Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning, a beginning rather than a demand. Nora found herself responding, her hands coming up to rest on his shoulders as something warm and sweet unfurled within her. When they finally separated, both a little breathless, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I should warn you," he said, "I've never been much good at temporary." Nora laughed softly. "Neither have I." That evening, as they sat by the fire inside the now floored cabin, there was a new awareness between them. Their conversation flowed as easily as ever, but there were longer glances, more smiles, an occasional touch of hands that lingered. "Tell me about your plans for this place," Xavier said as they finished their meal. "Beyond the cabin, I mean." Nora leaned back against the wall, considering. "I want to plant an orchard on the south slope. Apples, maybe some pears, a vegetable garden near the creek. Eventually, I thought I might keep a few chickens, maybe a cow." She smiled. "I brought books about all of it." "Of course you did," Xavier said with a fond smile. "What about the winters? They're long up here." I have plenty of books to read, and I thought I might write some of my own. Stories, maybe, or a journal of life out here. She looked around the cabin. I'll need to make furniture too, a bed, a table, chairs. I can help with that, Xavier offered. Furniture making was my father's specialty. I'd like to learn, Nora said, not just have you make things for me. Xavier nodded. I wouldn't have expected anything less. We'll build them together. The way he said together made Nora's heart skip. It was still strange to think of herself as part of a we, but not as uncomfortable as she might have expected. What about you? She asked. What would you do here besides build things with me? Xavier considered the question. I've always wanted to try my hand at raising horses. Good land for it here with that meadow to the east. He glanced at her. If that would be all right with you, it's your dream, Nora said. Of course it would be all right. They talked late into the night, sharing ideas and dreams, gradually weaving them together into a possible shared future. It was exciting and terrifying all at once, this unexpected detour from the solitary path Nora had imagined for herself. As the fire burned down to embers, Xavier rose and stretched. We should get some sleep, still plenty of work to do tomorrow. Nora nodded, suddenly shy. Their kiss earlier had changed things between them, but she wasn't ready for more not yet. As if reading her thoughts, Xavier smiled reassuringly. Good night, Nora, he said softly, moving to his bedroll on the other side of the cabin. Good night, Xavier, she replied, grateful for his understanding. The following days were filled with work and discovery. They completed the chimney, tested the draw of the fireplace, which worked perfectly, and began crafting simple furniture from the pine trees Xavier helped Nora fell and mill. Through it all, their connection deepened. Xavier taught Nora how to spot the straightest trees for lumber, how to read the grain of the wood, how to join pieces without nails when necessary. Nora showed Xavier the edible plants she'd identified in the forest, the best spots for fishing in the creek, the small journal where she recorded her observations of the land and its changes. They shared stories of their pasts, dreams for their futures, and increasingly, kisses stolen during breaks in their work or under the stars at night. Each day, the idea of Xavier leaving for Helena seemed more and more remote. One evening, as they sat outside watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, Xavier took Nora's hand. I've been thinking, he said. About us, about staying. Nora's heart quickened. And I want to, he said simply. Not just for the winter, but longer. To see what we might build together. He squeezed her hand. But I need to know it's what you want too, that I'm not changing the dream that brought you out here. Nora looked out at the land spreading before them, her land, her dream, but dreams could change, couldn't they? Expand to include new possibilities. When I left Boston, she said slowly, I was running away from a life where all my choices were made for me, where being a woman meant being someone's daughter, then someone's wife with no room to be myself. She turned to face Xavier. But you've never tried to take my choices away. You've only ever offered to help me build what I want to build. And I always will, Xavier promised. This is your land, Nora, your home. I'm just asking for a place in it. Nora reached up to touch his face, feeling the stubble rough against her palm. It could be our home, she said softly, if that's what you want. Xavier's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. It is, more than anything. He leaned down to kiss her, and this time there was nothing hesitant about it. Nora wrapped her arms around his neck, letting herself fall into the warmth and strength of him, into the promise of a future neither of them had expected to find. As autumn deepened toward winter, the cabin transformed into a home. Xavier built a proper bed frame, which they positioned against the north wall, away from the windows to minimize drafts. Nora sewed mattress ticking and stuffed it with sweet grass and pine needles. Together they crafted a table and 2 chairs, shelves for Nora's books, hooks for clothing and tools. They were married by a traveling preacher who stopped at their cabin on his way to more established settlements. It was a simple ceremony, with only the preacher's wife and a passing trapper as witnesses, but to Nora, It was perfect, a choice made freely. A commitment based on respect and shared dreams rather than societal expectations. Their first winter together was harsh but beautiful. Snow piled high around the cabin, transforming the landscape into a glistening wonderland. Inside, the fire Xavier had taught Nora to build and maintain kept them warm as they planned for spring. They read aloud from Nora's books, played chess on a board Xavier carved, and learned the contours of each other's bodies in the intimacy of their shared bed. When spring finally arrived, they set to work on their plans with renewed energy. Xavier began fencing the meadow for the horses he hoped to raise, while Nora planted her garden and the first saplings of what would become their orchard. They built a chicken coop and a small barn, working side by side as they had on the cabin. Sometimes in the evening, Nora would pause in her writing or cooking and watch Xavier as he worked on some new piece of furniture or repaired a tool. She would think about the strange twist of fate that had brought him to her half-built cabin that day, how different her life might have been if he hadn't ridden through, if she had sent him on his way, if they hadn't weathered that first storm together. "What are you thinking about?" Xavier asked, catching her gaze one such evening. Nora smiled. "How lucky I am that you happened to pass by." Xavier set down his tools and crossed to where she stood. "I think we both know it wasn't luck," he said, taking her hands in his. "Some things are just meant to be." As Nora leaned into his embrace, she thought about the cabin they had built together, stronger and more beautiful than she could have made it alone. Like the home they continued to create, log by log, day by day, their love was something neither of them had planned but both had helped to build, solid, enduring, and entirely their own. Over the years that followed, their homestead flourished. Xavier's small herd of horses grew, gaining a reputation throughout the territory for their strength and intelligence. Nora's orchard began to bear fruit, and her garden produced enough to preserve for winter with plenty left over to trade with passing settlers. The chickens multiplied and they added a milk cow, 2 goats, and a pair of pigs to their growing farm. The cabin expanded too. Xavier and Nora added a second room, then a covered porch where they would sit in the evenings, watching the sunset and talking about their day. They dug a root cellar, built a smokehouse, and constructed a workshop where Xavier could craft furniture that occasionally sold to wealthy families in Helena, when Nora made her twice-yearly trips to town for supplies they couldn't produce themselves. In their 3rd year together, Nora gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah, after Xavier's mother. 2 years later, a son joined their family, William, named for Nora's father. The cabin rang with children's laughter, with music from the fiddle Xavier carved during their 2nd winter, with the stories Nora told by firelight. They faced challenges, of course. A harsh winter when game was scarce, and they subsisted largely on preserved food from their cellar. A summer of drought that threatened the orchard, until Xavier devised an irrigation system from the creek. The fever that nearly took young William before a traveling doctor happened to pass through with the right medicine. Through it all, they worked together, supporting each other, building and rebuilding as needed. The partnership that had begun with the raising of a cabin roof deepened into something neither could have imagined when they first met. One evening, nearly 10 years after Xavier had first ridden into Nora's clearing, they sat on their porch watching Sarah and William play with the new foal born to Xavier's favorite mare. The apple trees were in bloom, their fragrance filling the air, and the garden was freshly planted for another season. "Do you ever think about it?" Xavier asked, his hand finding Nora's as it so often did these days, the gesture as natural as breathing. "What might have happened if I hadn't decided to check on that smoke I saw rising through the trees?" Nora squeezed his hand. "Sometimes, I like to think I would have managed on my own." "You would have," Xavier said with certainty. "You're the strongest person I've ever known." "But I'm glad I didn't have to," Nora admitted. "Building this life with you has been better than anything I could have planned." Xavier smiled, the lines at the corners of his eyes crinkling in the way she loved. When I left Pennsylvania all those years ago, I never thought I'd find a place that felt like home again. But that's what you've given me, Nora, a home, a purpose. We gave it to each other, Nora corrected gently. Log by log, Xavier laughed. Log by log, he agreed, leaning over to kiss her as their children chased the foal across the meadow and the sun painted the mountains gold. In the years that followed, their homestead became a landmark of sorts. Travelers would stop for a meal or a night's rest, drawn by the reputation of Xavier and Nora Jacobsen's hospitality. Some were passing through to points west. Others were looking to settle in the increasingly populated territory. All were welcomed, fed, and often sent on their way with a jar of Nora's apple preserves or a cutting from her garden. Sarah grew into a young woman with her father's skill for working with horses and her mother's determination. William inherited Xavier's talent for woodworking and Nora's love of books and writing. Both children learned the value of hard work, the importance of community, and the joy of building something with their own hands. As Montana changed around them, becoming a state, seeing the arrival of more settlers and the growth of towns, Xavier and Nora's homestead remained a place apart, a haven built on dreams and hard work and unexpected love. Sometimes, Nora would take out the journal she had started that first year, reading entries from those early days when she was alone, and then when Xavier arrived. She would marvel at how far they had come, at how the life they had built together was both nothing like what she had planned and everything she could have hoped for. On their 20th anniversary, Xavier surprised Nora with a new rocking chair for the porch, crafted from the wood of the very first tree they had felled together. "I've been saving it," he explained as she ran her hands over the smooth, polished arms, waiting for the right moment. "It's beautiful," Nora said, sitting in the chair and feeling how perfectly it fit her. "Like everything you make." Xavier knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. Though his hair was now streaked with gray and his face more lined, his eyes were the same storm gray that had captured her attention all those years ago. "We made something beautiful together, Nora," he said softly. "Not just this farm, not just our children, a life, a good one." Nora leaned forward to kiss him, this man who had helped her build not just a cabin but a home, not just a homestead but a family, not just a life but a love that had weathered every storm. "Log by log," she whispered against his lips, "and I wouldn't change a single one." As they sat together on the porch of the cabin they had built with their own hands, watching the sun set over the mountains that had become so familiar, Nora thought about that brave, lonely woman who had set out to build a life on her own terms. She had found something she hadn't been looking for: a partner who valued her strength rather than fearing it, who helped her build her dreams rather than replacing them with his own. And in that finding, she had discovered that independence wasn't about doing everything alone. It was about having the freedom to choose who to build with, log by log, day by day, year by year. That night, as they lay in the bed they had crafted together, Nora whispered, "Thank you for stopping that day, for offering to help build my roof." Xavier pulled her closer. "Thank you for letting me stay to build everything else." Outside their window, the Montana sky blazed with stars, watching over the home and the life they had built together stronger, more beautiful, and far more rewarding than either could have ever built alone.